Hello, thanks for joining me today. I've been meaning to broadcast over the past couple of days, but was distracted by the fact that my father and his partner decided to go on a cruise, which was obviously significantly alarming for me because I've been following COVID for a while, and I have some concerns about people electing to go on cruise ships, particularly if they're elderly and have underlying health problems or comorbidities, as it were. But still, I'm here because it's important to talk about the COVID virus. I've got some resources to share with you all and some things that you probably need to advocate for with your state and local governments, because the federal response is chaos and failure. And the problem with that is that chaos and failure impacts the trajectory of the disease. So when you get people all getting COVID quickly because you're inadequately testing for it and so not restricting the transmission pathways through infected individuals because individuals don't know they have it, it hasn't been confirmed because your federal government ordered the CDC to develop their own tests and reject the accurate test that had already been developed by the World Health Organization, or WHO. If we see here as a line representing the healthcare system capacity, actually that line's pretty thin. Let me draw this dotted line a little bit more obvious. If that's the capacity of your healthcare system and you get a bunch of cases because you take insufficient protective measures, then the healthcare system is overwhelmed because the graph of number of cases or the curve of case numbers is so high so quickly. Whereas if you do take protective measures, institute social distancing, i.e. cancel rallies, cancel big events, and encourage people to stay home, particularly super spreaders like super social people, and also children who are little disease vectors because they are inadequate hand washes and enthusiastic touches of things. With protective measures in place, you get a flatter curve. Still lots of people getting the disease, but spread out over a longer period of time. So I'll show you some graphs soon that show the different styles of responses from Philadelphia and from St. Louis in response to the flu decades and decades ago. So first, we'll also have a quick listen to a chap who's been an epidemiologist for decades, and he wants to tell us that the qualities of COVID-19 in terms of its virality, the degree of contagiousness of it, and also the severity of the conditions that it induces in certain population demographics combine to make it the most frightening disease that he has encountered in his career. So let's have a quick listen, because I think that's just a minute of his time and hours. All right.
It's the most frightening disease I've ever encountered in my career, and that includes Ebola, it includes MERS, it includes SARS. And it's frightening because of the combination of infectiousness and a lethality that appears to be many-fold higher than flu.
What scientists know about this virus so far? What concerns you most about it?
I think the most concerning thing about this virus is the combination of infectiousness and the ability to cause severe disease or death. And we have not since 1918,
the Spanish flu,
seen a virus that combined those two qualities in the same way. We have seen very lethal viruses. We have seen certainly Ebola or Nipah or any of the other diseases that CEPI, the organization that I run, works on. But those viruses have high mortality rates. I mean, Ebola's mortality rate in some settings is greater than 80%, but they don't have the infectiousness that this virus has. They don't have the potential to explode and spread globally.
Okay, so that's a little bit from that. He's saying the two elements that concern him the most are infectiousness and the severity of the disease. So it doesn't have as high a higher mortality rate as something like Ebola, which kills people very quickly, but it still causes significant disease and spreads to more people because it doesn't kill people as fast as Ebola. So people are still in danger, but there's more people in danger because that mortality rate is slower and less severe. I mean, the mortality rate of Ebola is very, very high for anybody who came in contact with it, but the severity of this is certainly much higher than flu, at least 10 times higher, because if flu mortality rate is 0.1%, then you have this, which is a minimum of 1% mortality rate. I'm getting a question, did I convince my dad not to go on the cruise? No, I didn't. He's on the cruise now. He assures me that he and his partner are washing their hands a lot, and there's nothing more I can do about it than that. But now we're going to look at some statistics in relation to the spread of the virus. There's a lady who's done a great thread on it. She's the Associate Director of Science and Technology at the Good Food Institute and has a PhD. So her qualifications are at least in the science arena. And she's also from an engineering background. So let's have a look at what she has to say, because she's talking numbers in a very understandable way. Okay. So she says, I think most people aren't aware of the risk of systemic healthcare failure due to COVID-19 because they simply haven't run the numbers yet. If we conservatively assume there's 2,000 cases in the US, and this is from March the 7th, so it's a couple of days ago, it's now March the 10th, we can see how exponentially cases have risen in Italy. So we're conservatively assuming that there's 2,000 cases on March the 6th, which is about 8 times the number of confirmed cases, but we know there's substantial underdiagnosis due to lack of test kits. So we can expect to see a doubling of cases every 6 days, which is a typical doubling time across several epidemiological studies. All right. So looking at about 1 million US cases by the end of April, maybe 2 million by May. I think my brother's going to have to call off his wedding. In Italy, was it Japan or Italy, where they cancelled access to weddings and funerals, or they just basically told people it's now illegal for you to have weddings and funerals. So I want to talk about, at some point today, the bigger picture of what's happening here, which is that patterns and trends and belief systems have put us in a position where a lot of the people in government are anti-governance. They're libertarians who don't believe in government, but they've managed to be elected to the position of government purely to sabotage existing institutions and better facilitate business. So the kind of people that thought, yes, business needs more power to run properly and to give us the incomes we need to flourish are the kind of people that voted for Trump, and also in Australia for our conservative government. Too many people, or a critical mass of people, were saying, yes, none of this commie arguments about social security, because you're also too kind to migrants and we're afraid of migrants and being Islamic extremists, so we're going to vote for the pro-business, anti-migrant people. Or the people who profess to be tough on migrants and tough on terrorist crimes associated with migrants. So right now, I'm very concerned about the fate of migrant children in American detention camps, or concentration camps, if you will, so called because they cram a lot of people together in very concentrated circumstances. Now, concentrated groups of people spread disease because they're in close contact, meaning droplets and fomites, surfaces that carry bits of infected secretions, are much higher when everybody's sharing quarters in that way. And the Trump administration will try and use that as leverage with their base, who are attracted to the prospect of being tougher on migrants. That is the purpose for them voting for Trump, pro-business, anti-migrants, in the belief that migrants lead to threats and criminality. All right, let's keep walking through this thread. So we're talking about what a caseload of this size means for the healthcare system, examining hospital beds and masks as just two factors. So if the US has 2.8 hospital beds per 1,000 people, okay, 2.8 hospital beds. With a population of 330 million, this is approximately 1 million beds. At any given time, 65% of those beds are already occupied. So this leaves about 330,000 beds available nationwide, perhaps a bit fewer this time of year with regular flu season. And at this point, if you have any people who are still pretending that the coronavirus is a hoax and saying it's just a variant of the flu, it's a good time to point out to them that there is pre-existing immunity to various variants of the flu in the community, whereas everybody is a virgin to COVID-19, which is why you worry about pandemics, because when you have a virgin or a naive population, things spread. There is no resistance. We don't have antibodies to protect us. There's not at least 50% of the population having some level of antibodies to this virus, which means more people will get it in a concentrated space of time, meaning these unoccupied beds, possibly 330,000 beds, are not going to be unoccupied for long. And there's going to be doctors and healthcare workers going through this on-the-run grieving process of having to make very difficult decisions, excluding elderly people from intensive care units because their prognosis is poorer than young people who also have the illness. It's mostly older people who die, but young people can still get it. And people who do get that severe iteration of the COVID virus are also likely to need weeks in intensive care because people's oxygen levels plummet who have this condition in a serious way, and they need to be intubated and on oxygen tanks, etc. They need care in a highly protected setting with people in hazmat suits so they don't get infected themselves. Otherwise, you also wipe out your healthcare workers. So at this rate, by May the 8th, all open hospital beds in the US will be filled. Imagine being a pregnant woman due to give birth in a US hospital in the coming months. Imagine having a child with asthma who needs hospital treatment or who might require hospitalization. Imagine breaking your leg and needing to go to a hospital when the hospital is full of people in hazmat suits, setting up intensive care units in the corridors because the system is overwhelmed, because there are more COVID-19 patients than there are available beds. So if only 5% of cases require hospitalization and hospital beds, then the exponential rate of patients means America can make it until May the 14th before being overwhelmed. As the healthcare system becomes increasingly burdened, therapy shortages, etc., people with chronic conditions that are normally well managed may find themselves slipping into states of severe medical distress, requiring intensive care and hospitalization. All right, so hopefully that was helpful. I don't have any administrative people on board who can help block trolls for me. My facts are very correct, and that's okay. I'm not surprised to be challenged by trolls. Like the whole of Italy, all of Italy is placed under coronavirus lockdown. Let's have a look. This is the BBC. I will bring up that for you. So we knew when Donald Trump was saying last week that it was no big deal, that the reckoning would come for that pronouncement sooner rather than later. So your Trump supporting friends who say it's all a damn beat up, will find it more difficult to explain how a Democratic Party media beat-up has resulted in the entire of Italy being under lockdown with emergency measures. So let's have a little scroll down. All of Italy placed under coronavirus lockdown. 60 million people are told to stay home amid the outbreak. Global shares crashing. That will get people's attention because a lot of the people who vote for Trump are middle-class people without a college education and white. Those are some significant ways to predict Trump votes. Not that it's a guarantee, but it just makes it more likely. That's a demographic with a strong propensity for voting for Trump. So those people do pay attention to the stock market because they are trying to save for retirement, and they've lost their retirement savings today and yesterday. So they might not pay attention to what happens in Italy because maybe reading international news or engaging with international news is just for Democrats or people with college degrees, but it's more difficult to ignore what's happened to the stock market. So have a look. The Prime Minister of Italy has ordered people to stay home and seek permission for essential travel. He said the measures were designed to protect the most vulnerable. There is no more time, he said in a TV address. Italy's coronavirus death toll jumped from 366 to 463. Cases of the virus have been confirmed in all 20 Italian regions. All right. So, who wants to know what the symptoms are or what they want to do? Or are women and children less affected? Yes, women and children are less affected, but unless you have a underlying health condition. Women seem to be less likely to die from coronavirus than men, and children seem to be less likely to die than other age groups. Most people will get a mild infection, but the hospital system is still getting overwhelmed in Italy. And doctors on social media in Italy have been posting about their heartbreak as they have to decide who to exclude from intensive care units. Yes, Trump called it a hoax, and it will be increasingly evident that it's not a hoax. All right, let's have a look at why children and women are less likely to catch coronavirus. So this is speculating. We don't really know. So you might be surprised to find there's a difference between men and women's death rates from coronavirus, but scientists aren't. Part of the answer is men are generally in worse health than women, owing to lifestyle choices like smoking. Which is a particular problem in China, where 52% of men smoke compared with just 3% of women. But women have intrinsically different immune responses to men. Women are more likely to suffer from autoimmune diseases, indicating that on a continuum of immune system reactivity, we're more likely to have very active immune systems. And there's good evidence that women produce better antibodies to vaccines against flu. Well, that's nice. Prejudice against Chinese people is spreading around the world, which is bad. So what we should probably share is remembering to tell people that diseases don't discriminate. Viruses don't discriminate. Anybody who comes into contact with a virus can get it, and anybody can die, but particularly older people. So not people from a particular race, older people with underlying health conditions with compromised lung function. And let's have a quick look also at the global shares plunging in the worst day since the financial crisis. In fact, I think it's worse than the financial crisis, isn't it? Because the circuit breakers that kicked in were activated more times than they were in the global financial crisis. So it's being called Black Monday. Interesting. Analysts described the market reaction as utter carnage. Interesting choice of words, because Trump referred to American carnage when he took office. That was a phrase from his speech. Stephen Miller probably introduced that phrase into Trump's speech. All right. I don't have my normal viewers because this is an earlier time than I would typically broadcast, but I'm still going to thank anybody who's listening now and any replay viewers as well. So Alan's noting that air travelers to Israel must spend 14 days in isolation. Yes, air travel is a particularly potent way to spread disease because of close confinement. So I hope that anybody who's listening to me who's concerned about what I'm saying, as well as washing their hands and taking individual protective measures and considering not going to large events and staying home, that we have to look ahead to how are people going to vote, which is an important way of getting the anti-governance people out of office, so to prevent further damage from the Trump administration, but also to consider the thousands of deaths that are likely to occur of the migrants in the Trump administration's care. So who is advocating for those people at present? The Trump administration has ordered for signage to be taken down from immigration courts, telling migrants to take extra care and wash their hands and not touch their face, etc. Why would that signage be taken down? To encourage the spread of disease amongst migrants, which will also encourage the spread of disease amongst non-migrants, amongst American citizens and residents. But if you are so selfishly determined to promote a narrative that benefits you politically, if you're determined to try and make migrants the culprit for the spread of disease, then yes, you purposefully take action to endanger migrants' lives, knowing that you're also going to be endangering the lives of American citizens as well. So Trump being such a clown is a potent political advantage for him, the same as it was for Hitler. People didn't take Hitler seriously for a long time. They dismissed him as a clown because he was an outlier. It wasn't the kind of politics they were used to, and that does a great disservice to humanity. So every time we're tempted to say Trump is a clown, we should stop it. Trump is an idiot, we should stop it. Trump is bad at governance, but Trump is also philosophically opposed to governance. And he's backed by people who are philosophically opposed to good American governance. I mean, Putin doesn't want America to be governed well. And the Koch brothers, the other corrupt corporate interest people who have backed the Republican Party and backed Trump, they're also not interested in good governance for the American people because they want America to be run without the tax system, without Social Security. They want to only pay tax to support a big military, and that's it. And they want to break America down and rebuild it in a way that financially advantages them more. Yes, so Trump doesn't just care about golf and re-election. He's actively facilitating Republican-driven breakdown of American healthcare systems and American social security systems and infrastructure systems. So a lot of the actions that Trump has taken, like appoint Betsy DeVos, etc., appoint corrupt people to lead the EPA and wind back regulations to protect American air and water, or to protect Americans from poor air and water quality. That is a hollowing out of American systems of governance. That is a hollowing out of the protections instituted to preserve American quality of life. So he's not just a goofball, he's actively sabotaging America. And we do better when we stay alert to that and stay on top of discussing it. Because a lot of tyrants, a lot of authoritarian dictators like Mussolini, I was thinking of a corrupt businessman, dictator, tyrant type person who got into office because people thought he'd be good for the economy, Silvio Berlusconi. Those people were put into office on the strength of people voting for what they thought was a strong economy led by a strong businessman, and they got corruption and incompetence. But those people like Berlusconi were eventually ousted because of people looking at the incompetence and tiring of those policies. So we can't just say Trump is a clown, because it doesn't lead us to enough focus on the policy outcomes of his actions, and the fact that there are people specifically advocating for him to take those actions. There are people in his orbit who want him to sabotage healthcare for migrants, and who want him to sabotage healthcare for Americans, to reduce America, to wind American civil liberties back to more of a feudal state where people are financially enslaved because they don't have the economic protections that have been hard won over the course of American history. The election was already decided once Joe Biden became the effective nominee. I mean, Joe Biden doesn't allow for American gullibility to be compounded by American sexism. American economic gullibility to be compounded by American sexism. So they're not universal problems. Some people are so economically gullible that when they're informed by partisanship and racism to ignore that the economy was in recovery under Obama, that they then vote for a businessman with a very thin reputation. Well, I say thin because to rational people, his reputation was very thin. They understood that if you are a multiple bankrupt, there are question marks over your competency as a person involved in the business world. But if people are too gullible because they watch Fox News and they've been hyped up into a state of thinking that the economy is terrible, then they're more vulnerable to falling for an economic charlatan like Trump. And that was compounded by sexism in the 2016 race. So those young men and those older men and even women associated with sexist men who are married to them, who are marinated in those points of view, were then less likely to vote for Hillary Clinton and to believe the worst of Hillary Clinton, tipping America over into that critical margin of an electoral college win for Trump. Yes, buying some Purell is something we can do as individuals, but as cogs in a community, we also need to be talking about social distancing and our intentions of staying home, organizing ways to entertain ourselves in our home. So it's not just about how do we prepare for if we have the disease, it's how can we all encourage each other to stay home, even though, yes, that will damage the economy. We need to stay home and advocate for stimulus payments. So the government has to go into debt in the hope that, yes, once COVID resolves and people get enough immunity and that healthcare systems are no longer being overwhelmed and broken by the onslaught of people who need intensive care in a hyper-protected facility, that eventually some type of economic activity will be restored. But we need to be looking out for each other. So working out how to stay home, how to supply care packages to people who've been out of work, but also how to pay rent. So people primarily need shelter as well as food. If people are evicted because they can't pay the rent because of a lot of industries closing down, then maybe we need to start getting community funds together for the people who are employed in tourism. No, I'm certainly not saying if the economy tanks, it will benefit Trump. I think Trump is purposefully sabotaging the healthcare of migrants in order to stoke a narrative that it's all the fault of people who aren't white and Christian. So the fault of brown Christians who have migrated or attempted to migrate to America from South America as a consequence of climate change frying their crops and making their lives untenable in communities that are dependent on the agricultural economy and the agricultural industry. So migrants who've come to America who are currently being detained in prison camps that Trump is using to charge the American taxpayers exorbitant amounts of money for, money that's then paid to private prison owners who donate to Trump. Does that make sense? Trump is advancing a narrative of it's all the fault of the migrants, or he's girding his loins to propagate such a narrative. But his first instinct was still to pretend it's a hoax and to feel sorry for him. And that's excellent, because the news really reported that and really reported people's backlash to Trump saying it was a hoax. And that has become a very predominant influence now, so that even if and when Trump tries to change the narrative to this is all the fault of migrants and he's going to close off the border to Mexico, too many people know now that that's too late. It's got nothing to do with the border between Mexico and the United States. Everybody needs to stop traveling and stay home. All of Italy's under quarantine measures. All of America at some point soon is going to be under quarantine measures, because you can't hide what's going to happen to American hospital systems. Within a few months, all of the available beds in America's intensive care units are going to be taken up by people requiring weeks of oxygen treatment to survive. And some of those people will be elderly, and some of those people will be younger. And healthcare workers will be fainting from dehydration in their protective suits, which will be, they have to use for as long as possible, because you have to destroy them once you take them off. Yes, so the Trumpers are already engaging in a lot of hate speech towards Chinese people. The bulk of Americans will be anxious enough that they don't want to hate. They won't see hate as a useful response to this crisis. They will want solutions. They will want to hear what plans are being put into place to help communities and economies from just completely collapsing in the coming months. Alan's sharing a link. I won't be able to click on the link, so perhaps if you just type out the Twitter account of the person whose thread you're recommending, I might be able to find it. They'll probably pin a tweet if it's really useful. Or if you follow me on Twitter, make a comment and I'll try to follow you back, and then you can direct message me the link you're recommending. So yes, to look ahead, that likely by early May, the hospital systems will be overwhelmed, that people operating on the front ranks, on the coalface of healthcare treatment, will be exhausted and traumatized. So we have to emotionally support healthcare workers. We have to, I think at state levels in blue states, proactive governors like Gavin Newsom will be trying to offer sick leave to people so that they can stay home. If the whole of America gets put under quarantine measures, how are we going to work? We'll have to pull together. How are you going to advocate for state governments to have rent relief packages for people so that masses of people are not made homeless? GoFundMe accounts will start rising, not for medical costs, but for people to not lose their homes. So a lot of people in America will be at risk of becoming homeless because of the economic contraction. And yes, under a good governance, this problem would not be as severe as it is now. It would have been contained. There would have been more testing to identify transmitters. But at the same time, you were always going to have people get it due to the nature of international travel and the facilitation of the spread of the disease by people getting to visit other countries and go back and forth. But it's just that under Trump, you get a high curve of everybody getting it very fast because they didn't do enough to stop super spreaders, to have tests available to identify people with the disease, and to then ask them to quarantine themselves, or to have mandatory quarantining periods for a number of weeks. So this curve of people getting the new virus is preferable and doesn't overwhelm your health system capacity, which is a dotted line here. So the government's aim should be to avoid overwhelm of healthcare capacity, and that should be your mantra now as well, what you should advocate for. Hi, Mr. Ed. Okay, so the press conference, the Attorney General says, was it the Attorney General? Somebody said children are not at risk, but it's true that children are not at risk of contracting severe forms of the disease, or they're less at risk. children do contract it and have mild symptoms and spread the disease. Children are vectors for this. So schools are going to close at some point. The more local authorities and regional authorities wise up to that. The children are vectors for the disease, touch hands, touch surfaces, and spread it, which then is transmitted to parents and facilitates community spread. So that's good that Trump is announcing some economic measures. So Mr. Ed says that Trump announced tax cuts, liquidation, etc., for businesses that allow their employees to work from home. That's good. I'm going to briefly pause to advocate for Joe Biden as the Democratic candidate, which he decisively is, and I guess people hopefully will still turn out to vote tomorrow. Because after that, it's over for Bernie's candidacy. It'll be more undeniable that he shouldn't run. Of course, it was fairly undeniable that he'd lost the race in 2016 and he continued to campaign because Bernie's ego is essentially a Russian asset in and of itself. Bernie causes harm to the Democratic Party and he damages the nominee of the party because he continues to campaign even when he's lost, and he campaigns by implying corruption on the part of everybody else other than him and his supporters. So Bernie, even after tomorrow, I'm saying it'll be more obvious that he's lost, but maybe we need to be very vocal in telling him to sit down as well. Once it's really obvious he's lost, we can just say, don't tolerate Bernie supporters. Just block them and try to advocate for everybody to not pay attention to them because they spread harm. They spread distrust of the Democratic Party. They complain that things are rigged. They undermine faith in the system of the primary election system. The thing is, yes, Trump can run on how he saved businesses with tax, but the devastation of the coronavirus is going to be so broad that Trump isn't going to be effectively able to run on how he did anything useful because none of his efforts are going to prevent a global recession now and probably even a depression in America. So the amount that the stock exchange, the stock system is going to fall will rival falls in the depression because there was already a problem of overvaluation in the market that Trump was keeping high for optics. He was getting the Fed, he was bullying the Fed into doing lots of quantitative easing and lots of injecting of funds and capital into the stock market system. Yay, Biden, Harris, woot woot. So yes, America will get more into debt. And it was already so much in debt, which was unfortunate because the economy was strong and there wasn't a crisis. And when I say strong, well, I often spend a lot of time talking about the weaknesses that Trump was introducing to the economy, the manufacturing recession that he induced through his instigation of a trade war, which hurt the manufacturing industry and then hurt families and businesses associated with that industry. So the spillover industries, the transport industry, were all suffering. So there were these weaknesses in the economy, in the US economy, job growth was slowing, etc. And Trump now gets a cover for that recession that he was already inducing by having facilitated the spread of coronavirus 19 through inadequate provision of testing protocols, through sabotaging use of the WHO organization's tests. So pretending that they had to develop their own test through CDC. So Trump is offering a temporary payroll tax reduction. There's going to be a lot of reduced income taken in by the government, and yet the government will need to take stimulus measures to prevent large swathes of people becoming homeless and being unable to keep up with their mortgage, etc. Lots of Americans are going to lose their homes because lots of industries are going to be affected. And when you affect lots of industries, you affect lots of employees. And when you affect lots of employees at once, you reduce demand for products and services. And when you reduce demand for products and services with some people, all of the incomeless employees or former employees of the tourism industries, the transport industries, etc., the entertainment industries, then that's contagion spreads. That's more people who aren't spending money, more people who are noticing that there's a crisis and therefore not spending money. So masses of people being confined to their homes is going to massively impact the economy, and Trump can't rescue it. People are going to be surrounded by disaster. And even though in some cases disaster supports the incumbent, I think too many Americans know that the criminal, corrupt, incompetent president is worth getting out of office, that he is compounding the problems. There's been enough discussion in the media of failures, I think, and enough priming of the electorate to know that Trump's a criminal, that he called Ukraine and used their military vulnerability against Russia to blackmail them into participating in a corrupt takedown attempt of his the candidate he most fears, Joe Biden. Vice presidents are popular candidates when they run for office. So there's a history to this. A lot of former vice presidents have been successful in their presidential bids. So Biden was always the candidate to beat. I don't know why we wasted time talking about it, but I guess it had to meet a critical mass of people actively supporting and cheering for Biden to motivate him to hit his stride and to start being able to sound confident, to communicate those alpha male properties in debates that then helped support coalesce around Biden, helped him pull away from the pack enough that everybody who, helped Americans process their feelings in relation to the post-traumatic stress disorder response to the surprise overturning of the popular vote in 2018. So people were so surprised and hurt and distressed by that and by all the corruption and mismanagement that's followed that they were really anxious about making sure the right nominee was elected this time. And they were really keen to support competent people. But the presidential race isn't just about competency. It's about being a figure who can appeal to a broad enough range of people to help them feel an emotion akin to trust. We trust that you will represent our needs and not exclusively the needs of a smaller group. So the people who voted for Trump, some of them believed he would govern well for all of America. And some of the Trump supporters just hated various parts of America and wanted their political will to be made manifest via Trump, even knowing that they weren't popular points of view, even knowing that it's not the will of the majority to overturn Roe v. Wade. They were just very keen on having their white Christian dominionist wishes manifested into policy by Trump. Yes, so Trumpers are already blaming Obama because they do that. What matters is our vulnerability to that rhetoric. What matters is the vulnerability of independents to that rhetoric. And I think we're safe because the gullibility and stupidity of various people is not compounded by sexism when there is a male candidate. And I'm not endorsing sexism, but until America has got over its sexism, got over its inherent distrust of women in leadership positions, then you don't need sexism on the pile of problems that you have when you're under attack from a hostile foreign government like Russia and Saudi Arabia that want to weaken and undermine America. I mean, the Saudi Arabian government, in all probability, helped support the 9/11 terrorists, and some of them were in contact with Saudi Arabian embassy staff, and that was published in an expose a few months ago. So we should keep it in mind. Not only is America under attack from Russia, but also from Saudi Arabia. And America has a problem with residual sexism. And now that's not a problem in the presidential candidacy, in the presidential race. So good. Good. I mean, sexism wasn't such a problem that Hillary Clinton couldn't win the popular vote. She did. Enough Americans are comfortable with women in leadership that they could do that. But because you have the Electoral College, which disproportionately awards power to people from rural, more conservative states, compounds the problem of racist blindness to Obama's economic victories or economic achievements, or the achievements of America's economy under Obama. People from rural, more conservative states just a little bit tipped the election to Trump because of the power of the Electoral College to overturn the popular vote result. So Hillary Clinton won the 2016 election by any normal democratic measures, but you have an anti-democratic provision built into your constitution, which the founders must have hoped would never be too... they hoped that rural people would never abuse their power and vote for a tyrant. But they didn't anticipate the compounding factors of sexism, Russian interference, and a black man in the presidency, making people irrationally susceptible to disinformation about how the economy was doing. If Americans had appreciated the economy under Obama and its growth, if enough Americans had appreciated the growth trajectory of the American economy under Obama in his final term, then you wouldn't necessarily have Trump. But there's a whole lot of factors, obviously, in preparing the ground for Trump to eke out a tiny 77,000 margin of victory in the Electoral College system, thus awarding him the US presidency. Yes, Australia has had a female prime minister, and people responded in a very sexist way to her as well. Following a female prime minister, the backlash of conservative discomfort with that gave us a very conservative government that undermined the Australian economy, that undermined people's wages in vulnerable positions in the casual workforce by attacking unions and keeping the payments low for Social Security beneficiaries because of the conservative position that you shouldn't govern, you shouldn't provide a safety net, you should just facilitate business and reduce regulations that do slow businesses down. But also you need to strike a balance between facilitating, expediting business growth and endangering the public. Yes. Ibris says Democrats are rejecting populism and America has changed post-2016. Americans were always moderate anyway. There was always a bulk of moderates. It's just that there was a subsection of moderates who thought, oh yeah, a businessman will be good for the economy and he's pro-white people, so then we don't have to worry about leftist people coming in and making us apologize for our treatment of black people and Native Americans and depress economic activity by being more pro-people than they are pro-business. So enough Americans feared the leftism and progressivism and feared an increase in social safety measures, social security measures, and underappreciated what Democrats do for the economy, that they voted in someone who had a false construct of successful businessmen created for him by television, that very potent medium of television. So too many Democrats stayed home on election day because of, yes, complacency. They were told Hillary would definitely win. People have done a study showing that statistical reporting on television and on paper mediums or digital mediums have more of an impact on Democrats than they do on Republicans. So when Democrats see statistics like there's a certain high probability that the Democratic candidate will win, they pay attention to that. And that's a negative artifact of disproportionate Democrat respect for science and for the science of mathematics. So yes, Biden's definitely going to be the nominee. And if you saw footage of Kamala Harris being asked if she would be the first, well, the question sounded like, will you be the first vice president? But presumably they meant, will you be the first female vice president or the first black female vice president? And she laughed and laughed and said, old boy's got to win the nomination first. What did he say? Old boy's got to win the election first? So it's not the case that Joe Biden will have to win the election first, although it is, I guess. But the question is, when will he get to announce that Kamala Harris is his running mate? There's a lot of support for that pairing online. You can really see that it's a very potent electoral combination for Biden and would cement him the nomination easy, although the nomination is already cemented for Biden, but it would consolidate that definite win for him for the nomination. And it would consolidate his definite win for the presidency. So Kamala Harris is an obvious choice. When will he make that announcement? Good question. At least we know Kamala's endorsed him now, and that people are asking her, are you going to be the next vice president? And I guess they probably need to delay the nomination a little bit so that Bernie Sanders supporters don't complain that it's rigged. I don't know. Progressivism is alive in America, yes, because people appreciate that America has lurched to the right and America has abandoned a lot of the progressive gains that protect working people, that protect wage earners. I should say wage earners because the term working people is now too synonymous with Bernie's rhetoric, which is a little bit associated with communism now on the part of moderates. So wage earners are protected by democratic measures to have judges who don't rule against wage earners in favor of corporations, to have Supreme Court appointments who don't do things like rule for Citizens United and allow corporations to donate huge amounts of money to super PACs and thereby control the information Americans see in ads and thereby advocate powerfully for pro-corporate, anti-wage earning policies. Pro-corporate, anti-air breather policies. So if you breathe air and drink water and have children and hope to live a life that is not too contaminated by industrial pollutants that give you neurological diseases, then yes, you don't want the Republicans to appoint any more Supreme Court judges to depress the interests of wage earners and just individuals who drink water and breathe air. So yes, Bernie is finished in his nomination run. I'm glad you agree with me for that. And Biden is more, yes, Biden has moderate appeal, but is still essentially a progressive. Obama was a progressive as well. He's from a progressive administration that could have done more were it not that too many Democrats suffered from the fallacy of presidential omnipotence. So too many Democrats stay home in midterm elections because they think they've done what they needed to do by electing a progressive president, and then they stay home in midterms. Whereas Republicans who are seeking to protect their property rights from what they view as the potential incursions by pro-social progressive democratic measures, they always turn out. They're older, more conservative, and they turn out to midterms because in their mind, they're voting to keep their taxes low. So it's very motivating for all elections to do that. Or they're voting to prevent tax increases, which is what they associate Democrats with. And for good reason. Democrats are for increasing the infrastructure and increasing the safety net. Also improving the infrastructure of America. And those are good goals, but they do need to be kept in check by responsible conservatives who have to be there to advocate for limits on taxation, for effective spending of taxation monies and effective distribution. I don't want the word effective, actually. I want the word efficient spending. Unfortunately, we don't have a responsible Republican Party. The Republican Party has gotten overly invested in just retaining power for power's sake. They've corrupted themselves by accepting too much money from bad faith actors like the current iteration of the NRA. And they've succumbed to corporate interests and lost sight of advocating for the people. So they think it's enough to advocate for lower taxes. They've permitted infrastructure to crumble in various areas across America, which does not help American growth. So Republicans are a limiting factor on the success of American communities and the American economy. They might describe to themselves that they're a facilitating factor for American innovation and growth, but they're not really even that as well, because they've supported anti-migrant racists like Representative Steve King of Iowa, who pretends that migrants are a threat to the American way of life, when in fact America needs to attract migrants because migrants are often responsible for business innovation, and migrants coming to a country have a positive impact on economic growth because they are consumers and they add to the productivity of the American economy. So Ibris is saying, when Biden finishes Bernie tomorrow, expect an early Obama endorsement. That'd be nice. I guess when he's the only candidate left standing, it's a good time for Obama to come out and say, yes, my progressive presidency. And for more people to say, you can't just elect a progressive president and believe that that's the solution to your problem. You need to elect a progressive majority for the House and for the Senate, because Congress passes the laws, and too many Americans forgot that. Too many Democratic voting Americans forgot that they need laws to protect American workers and American wage earners. Thank you. I have a compliment. I'm going to put it on screen. Ibris says that I have a fantastic working knowledge of American politics. Thank you, sir. I have worked hard on it. There is something that we could do intellectually, which is, or at an emotional level, which is to increase the amount of compassion we feel for America's prison population and America's detained migrant population. So Trump is the opposite of an advocate for compassion. People who support and follow Trump are people essentially intoxicated on the feeling of omnipotence associated with cruelty and a relaxing of civility norms, a relaxing of a feeling of obligation to others, a ramping up of individualism at the expense of others. So they talk a lot about patriotism, but their actions, or the actions of the Trump administration, are directed towards undermining government support or collective support for individuals. So undermining communities because food stamps are gone. So people aren't helping each other out in that way anymore. So Republicans who sabotaged the schooling system, and I forget sometimes whether it was Kansas or Kentucky. Was it Kansas that defunded a lot of American schools and were voted in by people who were possibly suffering from some racist suppositions that African-American dominant schools would be the most affected by cuts. They were hoping, because they'd seen Fox News, that it was African-Americans who were disproportionately the beneficiaries of welfare, of state payments. And that assumption is a very damaging one for white people, because, as well as being very damaging for Black people, because when white Americans vote punitively against African Americans by voting against government propping up of infrastructure such as public schools, it takes them a little while to figure out that that actually hurts schools that have white majority populations as well, and that they're being pushed into too much of a perilous position of having to bake brownies every weekend, or the Spanish teacher gets fired. So white people eventually turned on their Republican governor in a state that begins with K, and I learned about it, but I've forgotten. So there's usually pushback against Republicans, but often when it's too late. And what we need to collectively do as consumers of media and as people who do have more of a voice than we realize, who can write letters, who can speak up, who can capitalize on any reputation we have in our communities for being decent, responsible people. Our voice matters, and particularly when people don't expect it from us. So I'm someone who's quite ranty now, and people expect that from me. If you're someone who's normally quiet and puts their head down and just does their job as a dentist or a small business owner, your actions have greater power now than mine, because you are an outlier, and the human psyche pays close attention to outliers, things in the environment that are novel and different. So if you speak out, if you advocate for more governance, if you be like those voters in Kentucky or Kansas who eventually turned on their Republican governor and said, restore school funding, we have to say, restore community funding, restore social programs, because the world is suffering now from too many people in government who are against the idea of government, who are in government purely because they can have power and importance off the back of the critical mass of voters who believe that, who have swallowed the line that governance in and of itself is inherently bad and flawed and corrupt. So when we rehabilitate the very idea of government, and it's not a coincidence, the idea of government and support for the idea of good governance was undermined around the world until we came to a disaster that needed good governance. So there was going to be something at some point that highlighted the weaknesses of having elected too many conservative governments around the world that operate to hollow out government, that operate to funnel money to their friends and peers, whilst capitalizing on the number of voters who will respond favorably to rhetoric about how government is essentially flawed, how taxes need to be cut, how business is a better system of government, how having private enterprise is sufficient. So when a coronavirus circumstances, in a pandemic, we remember private enterprise cannot coordinate the kind of effective responses we need to stay safe. So now we're all suffering from the emotional fallout of 9/11, the rejection of government because it couldn't keep us safe from terrorist attacks in that moment, and the overly negative attributions that people have, too many people, not everyone, but that too many people, a critical mass of people, rejected the idea of government, because conservatives are the anti-government government. And Trump hollowed the government out, used opportunity zones to funnel money to his son-in-law, probably illegally traded on the stock exchange while he was manipulating it in predictable ways through his tweets. And the stock market is probably done being gullible for Trump. Trump's incompetence has been broadly exposed on an international stage in response to a crisis. So Trump failure, Trump incompetence is endangering America, crashing the stock market. If that sounds like I'm attributing too much to Trump, that's fair. I'll wind it back a bit and say there are a lot of conservative governments around the world who have been too slow in devising an effective response. China has a totalitarian government which has responded effectively to coronavirus after initially facilitating its spread because they just shut up. They just acted to disenfranchise the people who were trying to alert them to the problem, because totalitarian governments totalitarian governments initially care about optics and just preserving the appearance of efficacy. But at the same time, once it gave up on trying to hide coronavirus from itself, once the Chinese government stopped subduing people who were like doctors who were trying to break the news of a massive uptick in infectious flu type cases, filling up their intensive care units in their hospitals. Once they did that, then they were able to do more. They were able to quarantine people and enforce quarantines in a way that totalitarian governments are quite good at. Dave M has said he's just logged in and he's getting ready for bed, and the Toronto Stock Exchange dropped 10% today. It's pretty significant, isn't it? I wish I'd studied more economic history because I'd love to have some facts and figures. Dave Monroe's cat, thank you. I'd love to have more facts and figures at my fingertips about the history of the stock exchange to be able to say, yes, 10%. Is that greater than any given drop during the global financial crisis, or does that just match the greatest drops experienced by the stock exchange during the GFC? Because I'm tempted to say it's probably worse, because I'd heard that there were less things triggered, less, what are they called? Circuit breakers, when trading is halted because of the significance of drops. All right. I'm still getting advice from people about what to do about my parents being on a cruise. I asked yesterday when there was a very small remaining window of opportunity as to what to say to them to deter them from going on a cruise, because they're elderly and have pre-existing conditions. But yes, I'm still getting updates on Twitter with people giving me advice about just say goodbye to them, say bon voyage. There's two camps of responses. People who say, yes, wish them a happy trip and ask them for their passwords and who's the executor of their will. And then the other camp of people saying, yeah, they're adults, wish them a good time. It's their choice, leave them alone. They're on a cruise. They assure me they're going to wash their hands a lot, but that's not my only concern at this point. But you know what? 50% chance they're fine. Yep. I cannot stop them. I tried very hard. I threatened to book a holiday for them and to pay up front for a non-refundable holiday for them in a different location to try to get them to get off the boat, which was quite a strong-arm tactic on my part. But I thought if they're worried that I'll lose some money, then they'll accept my present and get off the boat and go stay at this beautiful luxury hotel that I was going to book for them. But yes, good luck to them. Somebody points out that failure and chaos also benefit Putin. Is that a coincidence? No, it's not. Putin and the KGB cultivated people for years to try and find people who were sufficiently vain and narcissistic and high profile, they could potentially one day run for presidency and be indebted to Russia and therefore to a degree under Russian influence. So Trump is under Russian influence, as you can see when he puts a hold on sanctions against Ukraine, which Russia is attacking for the purpose of acquiring and getting Ukraine's fossil fuel resources to get access to the oil and gas reserves in Ukraine. Yes. So who can we feel compassion for? We have to mitigate the individualism promoted by Trump and the Republican Party and counter it with pro-community talk. Pete Buttigieg was as popular as he was because he talked a lot about a return to service and working together and addressing problems like disinformation on social media and people's mistaken belief in the supremacy of the president or the omnipotence of the president, and under acknowledging the power of Congress in passing laws that have impacts on the American population that are merely signed into being by the president. The president sets the emotional tone and also the ethical tone for a country. So Trump's ethical tone has been to commit crimes and to facilitate or to make legal unethical behavior by businesses. So his gutting of the EPA and the gutting of Obama-era regulations to protect Americans is a way of facilitating business at the expense of American communities. No, Pete Buttigieg, if he'd been older and had some more experience, could potentially have overcome the Electoral College barrier to success. But Pete Buttigieg did not have enough experience. You can't beat a vice presidential candidate with some experience, because vice presidents have the profile and the popularity, and in Biden's case, the position. He was a vice president to an extremely popular president who introduced healthcare for millions upon millions of Americans. Possibly 30 million Americans gained access to healthcare under the Affordable Care Act. So that's not easily unwound. Even John McCain wouldn't facilitate that. So Republicans helped save, or a Republican helped save the Affordable Care Act, helped save the broadening of access to healthcare made possible by the Trump-Biden government. I'm sorry, the Obama-Biden government. What a terrible error. I'll say the whole sentence again. Access to 30 million people gained access to healthcare because of the actions of the Obama-Biden government and the Obama-Biden-led party, which in Congress was led by Nancy Pelosi, who helped to push the Affordable Care Act through Congress, which it needs to pass through before it can be made into law. People who have neglected to give Nancy Pelosi and her team of Democrats in the American House of Representatives are also responsible for contributing to that mistake, that intellectual mistake of conflating all of the power with the presidency, when power is distributed in the American political system through three branches of government. I have a commenter on YouTube who's saying that Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act is unpopular with Republicans. I think actually the Affordable Care Act is probably popular with more Republicans than you know, Republicans who are on the lower economic end of the continuum. And they only say they don't like the Obamacare Act because they're racist and partisan. Those who just are asked on whether or not they like the Affordable Care Act are more in favor of it. So anybody saying Nancy needs to go is sabotaging or sabotaging the ability of Americans to understand who to thank for the expanded access to healthcare. And expanded access to healthcare should be, the benefits of that should be much more visible to people right now, should be much more blatantly obvious to people when you have an outbreak, a disease outbreak of this magnitude, because you should be able to see how the health of the poorest among you is a determining factor for the health of even wealthier people. That when too many people are deprived of access to healthcare because of structural deficiencies, such as paying people so little that they don't have a living wage and can't pay for healthcare in the manner in which it's distributed in the US, that you then have a significant uptake in disease rates, and people who can't afford to stay home from work, people who can't afford to see a doctor, people who can't afford to pay for testing when the coronavirus tests cost money. No, the stock market in Australia is significantly crashing. The Australian economy is going to go into significant recession. Our government has at least caved to pressure to introduce a stimulatory payment, but I don't know who they're going to give that stimulatory payment to yet. the best people to give it to is households, because Australia avoided succumbing to the global financial crisis in 2009 because they handed out $900 to every Australian citizen. Everyone. There was no bureaucracy put in to determine if someone was overseas or not. Just they blanket gave every Australian citizen on the electoral rolls $900. So if you're 18 years old or over, you got a huge sum of money that you weren't expecting. And what people do with unexpected windfalls is they spend it. So that propped up the Australian economy, sustained consumer confidence, and kept all of the vulnerable industries afloat. So I think I've used up enough of my voice talking now. I should go do some writing instead, but thanks for listening. And yes, I will say that it's a great thing that Nancy Pelosi did in ripping up the State of Union address, because it was full of lies, and it was very powerful and important to see a symbolic gesture from someone in government rejecting the voluminous quantity of lies emanating from the mouth of the corrupt, dishonest President of the United States. People should know that Democrats spoke out against the propensity for lying of the US president, the occupant of the Oval Office. Nancy knows he's a liar. You should all be catching up with that now. If there are any holdouts as to the extent and nature of Trump's self-serving pattern of lying, then you should be disabused a lot of those doubts by now. What do I foresee as the future of the summer global markets? I'm much more pessimistic than other people, because I'm paying attention to the pre-existing weaknesses in the economies, the downward pressure on global trade instigated by Trump through his trade wars that were created to feed his macho image as a strongman who would take decisive action. So he decisively sabotaged global trade. He decisively sabotaged farming, and he threw $28 billion worth of public money at farmers to hide what he'd done to them, but it didn't fix the problem. It might have helped them cling still to their biases that Trump is a good leader, and helped with the psychological accommodation of preventing them from reflecting on the mistake that they had made in voting for Trump. But it couldn't help them in a long-term basis, which is why the bankruptcy rate of farms has gone up 20% over Trump's tenure in office. So farmers don't have ongoing trading relationships anymore with China, and the bailout money doesn't last forever, and was also disproportionately distributed towards wealthy farming businesses. So no, Trump has lost the election to Biden the minute Biden became the obvious nominee, but COVID definitely cements that loss because Trump's anti-migrant rhetoric has lost its appeal when the threat to the American economy, to American livelihoods, to American individuals is now greater than the remembered threat of 9/11. So Trump was able to capitalize on the residual racist fears associated with 9/11, that people overgeneralize the risk to their communities, to their families, to being any migrants, or particularly to Muslim migrants. So for them, they sought reassurance in a candidate prepared to be tough and exclude Muslims from the country, which was a nonsensical protective measure because you already have Muslim people in the country. There's no point pretending to protect people by excluding Muslims, because then unless you try and go full Hitler and imprison and detain all of the Muslims in America, there's nothing you can do to say, oh, we're now safe from Muslims. It was just pandering to irrational fears of Muslims. Whereas what you should really have is a rational fear of government negligence in relation to intelligence sharing, You should have strengthened intelligence communities that share information well. You need to be afraid of incompetence. That's what leads to 9/11. There are always enemies, but facilitating relationships with adversarial governments like Saudi Arabia is what weakens you and makes you more vulnerable as a nation to 9/11 terrorist attacks. So the intelligence organizations have been very good in protecting America since 9/11, but the pessimism inculcated by Fox News to pretend that Obama was exposing America to threat, to pretend that America was somehow boosting Iran by unfreezing Iranian funds that had been blocked, just to help make America be more safe and reduce the likelihood that Iran would develop nuclear weapons. So Obama put a lot into an effective treaty with Iran, or an effective deal with Iran about nuclear technology, but Trump sabotaged all of that, and he had the go-ahead from the proportion of the electorate that watches Fox News, that consumes conservative media, that consumes irrational fear of nuclear deals, that promotes irrational fear of Muslim migrants in general, which is a problem which is not something that you can be solved unless you go full Hitler, if that was your idea of a solution. So he just was making placatory gestures to the fears of Fox people, and that's how Donald Trump rose to power. The fears of Fox News viewers of Mexican migrants, or any South American migrants, and their irrational fears of their overgeneralized irrational fears of Muslim migrants. So yes, I have a commenter saying Trump is going to defeat Biden, barring a recession, depression. I don't know if you've noticed the stock market lately, but you have a recession and a depression. You have one. COVID and Trump's incompetence in combination have delivered that for you on a plate. The COVID virus, COVID-19, the trade war have weakened America, and Trump's incompetence and deliberate sabotage of the CDC, slashing of the pandemic response units around the world funded by America, slashing CDC funding, and appointing someone to lead the CDC whose credentials are more about being a Trump loyalist and also a very religious person who worked with groups that didn't want to develop medical treatments for HIV/AIDS. So that's the kind of pro-religious, anti-public health person that you have leading the CDC right now. So the recession is fast upon you. It's a very fast-acting recession. A lot of industries are going to collapse. A lot of Americans are either going to have to stay home or contract a virus which will potentially not only kill their elderly relatives, but overwhelm their healthcare system, preventing pregnant women from getting care in hospitals, children from getting care in hospitals. People with conditions that are managed by occasional hospital visits are going to be at greater risk of death. So no, you definitely have a recession. People won't be traveling. People will be staying home. Italy under quarantine now, and the entirety of Italy is what is lying in a wait for America within a number of months, probably by May, because your hospital systems will be so obviously blatantly overwhelmed that there'll be no point blaming migrants. Trump is trying to give migrants the disease. The fact that they sent healthcare workers to greet Americans being evacuated from Wuhan in the Travis Air Base without protective gear or training, healthcare officials who would then go on to interact with migrants, shows a level of purposeful carelessness that means they were trying to give people in blue states the disease. But now, CPAC, the conservative conference, is associated with the spread of the disease. That's the death knell for Trump's government. They can't pretend to be competent. They mixed with a patient zero who had COVID and shook hands at a conservative conference and then also weren't honest with people afterwards. When they found it out, they haven't told attendees who the patient is so that they can't self-quarantine because they don't know if they interacted with the infected person or not. So the level of COVID-19 that's just going to impact the actual Trump administration now, that is impacting Republican senators. Ted Cruz is in self-quarantine. Republican Representative Paul Gosar is in quarantine. There's going to be more of them. Matt Gaetz is in quarantine. That signals to the world who was lying about it being a hoax, who was underpreparing when they told us it was nothing, when Trump said that it was all contained and that there was 15 cases and that they were headed for zero. People know that it's Trump. He cannot escape the reporting now on his incompetence. So even if he tries to pretend it's just a blue state something, because he purposefully infected people in California at the Californian Travis Air Base by having the Department of HHS. What does that stand for? Health and something. Yes, it's likely that Americans will have to start paying at a federal level for the test because people can't pay $1,000 to be tested. But Trump was hoping for that. He was hoping that people would not get tested because he wanted the numbers to get down, because he doesn't understand the nature of pandemics, that if you don't test people and you don't identify who had the disease, your containment efforts are ruined. They understand enough to try and propagate the disease in California, but they don't understand enough to know that it's soon going to be so broad that it will also upend the economies of red states, which are already disproportionately dependent on federal dollars from tax money collected by blue states. So let's be honest about that. Red states are disproportionately dependent on blue states. If you look at the overall picture, the number of red states that accept high quantities of federal dollars are higher than the number of blue states accepting large quantities of federal dollars. And blue states like California are generating the masses of revenue that goes into federal coffers that pays red states to help them. Dave in Canada is saying 72 cases here, no deaths. It'll come to Canada, but with good management, which the Canadian government hopefully is doing, and it would be hard to be worse than the Trump government, you'll get a lower curve that still has a lot of cases, but everybody gets it at a slower pace, which falls underneath the line of healthcare system capacity. Because when that's overwhelmed, when everybody gets it very quickly, because spreaders haven't been quarantined, because the Trump administration and the Trump CDC have effed up testing efforts and are still effing up testing efforts and are thus effing up containment strategies. That means people get it rapidly, the growth is more exponential of new cases, the spread is more, the trajectory is steeper, and the healthcare capacity reaches overwhelm. So no, Americans, even though, yes, racist rhetoric will circulate, rhetoric against China will circulate, rhetoric against migrants will circulate. Trump will do all those things to try and blame Mexicans. It is beyond his capacity to trick people about now. It is beyond his capacity to deceive it. The genie can't go back in that box. Americans will see all of their hospitals have overwhelm in their intensive care units, have intensive care units being established in corridors. America's not organized enough to be building hospitals as quickly as China does, although at some point people will start suggesting that. Build quarantine hospitals because of the masses of COVID patients that are going to overwhelm your healthcare system. Because the structure of America's economy is that some people in America are underpaid, that the right has been too successful in getting votes, too successful in tricking people into thinking the government is inherently flawed and corrupt. So too many people have let Republicans gain power, and they have undermined the working class and undermined wage earners, so that wage earners now are more vulnerable, or low wage earners are more vulnerable to being forced to work while sick or lose their house and become homeless. Republicans and the Republican pressure exerted by Republican voters on Congress, and even Republican pressure on Obama, have made detention centers a thing, which are now going to be hotspots for disease transmission, because anybody who works in a detention center is going to get exposed to the disease. Trump wouldn't allow doctors to immunize migrants for the flu virus. Doctors protested en masse outside Trump detention camps because they weren't allowed to give free flu shots to the detainees. And those American citizen employees are going to leave their place of work and go home to their families, and they're going to give their families COVID-19. So yes, scientists believe the virus will weaken during the hot summer, but the virus is still on such an exponential trajectory that anybody who's still saying that is ignoring the level of transmission, of community transmission, that you're going to be at very soon. Cases have been more than doubling in Italy. They double within six days. So no, the April's not going to make the virus go away. You're going to have rampant community transmission, and the only thing that would help is if people started to adopt a St. Louis approach. Okay, I can get this up on screen. How can I do that? I know how I can do it. I can find lady who did a good graph. So the magnitude of the challenge is yes. Okay. All right, click share. Dun, dun, dun. Nope, wrong one. Okay. I'm bringing up some graphs for you, so it's very important. Thanks, Dave. Thanks for listening. All right, so that's the projected trajectory. If growth continues unabated, this cluster alone may be responsible for 1,100 active infections by March and 2,000 infected people by March 15. So we'll go back to that thread to check it out in a moment. Yep, so prepare for the disease burden roughly 10 times severe flu season. All right, so we'll go back to a thread about the numbers. Well, so this is only from a few days ago when there was a community transmission cluster in Snohomish. Does anybody know where Snohomish is? All right. Okay, I'll mute that and I'll keep looking. Yes. So somebody says China infection is on the decline. Yes, China has built the hospitals to increase their healthcare capacity. They built a hospital in 3 weeks. They've built quarantine hospitals. They've exerted incredibly severe quarantine measures on their population. They quarantine masses of cities. Can you imagine what it's going to do to the American economy to quarantine cities, to quarantine millions upon millions of American people? Your economy is going to crash, and that's just what's going to happen because people can't function. It's not just, oh, if the governments choose to impose this or not. People will start to self-quarantine out of community panic because of what is going to happen to your hospitals. What is happening in Italy is happening to you in a few months. So somebody's saying America's world-class facilities, including emergency military triage units, will cope. You're confident. I'm not confident because of the numbers of Americans who have to work sick because of poor union protections, poor government protections for people of less means, because of the political disenfranchisement of poor people since Citizens United, and also the mass brainwashing of people in America with Republican libertarian propaganda that has contaminated people's understanding of why government is necessary. So good governance is necessary to help for things like, to help for crises, like mass disease outbreaks, etc. People have forgotten what government is for. They think only military might is needed, whereas you need a might of pandemic response units. And Trump slashed the budget for disease response units. He eliminated the position of global health czar. He and the whole team of people, he fired them and he eliminated their positions. And when I say Trump, I should say Trump's administrations, because that was done in concert with John Bolton acting as head of the National Security Council. So yes, America is more vulnerable than China because America has inefficient governance at this point. China's government is tyrannical, but it's also efficient. Trumpism is infected by Russian influence, which seeks for the undermining and weakening of American global geopolitical influence so that Putin can successfully invade and acquire more European countries and more European fossil fuel resources. So you've got a combination of a tyrannical and inefficient government and pre-existing conditions that are hard on many working Americans who have multiple jobs, no access to healthcare, and no ability to take time off work. No access to sick leave and no access to medical care. And the combination of those factors means America's rural hospitals are going to be overwhelmed. America's urban hospitals are going to be overwhelmed within a number of months. So it's not just a question of preparing your food supplies. How are you going to prepare for economic collapse? How are you going to prepare for an economic recession where your neighbors might be made homeless because they've lost their jobs in the tourism industry or the entertainment industry, and they have no income and they have no ability to continue to pay for their accommodation without an income supply, and they have inadequate income protection. So how are you going to advocate for the federal government to respond efficiently to that when your government is associated with inefficiency and corruption? So the evident inefficiency and corruption of the current US government is notable in their inability to get widespread testing up and running. They were saying the CDC said they would have 1 million tests available last week, and now they're still saying 75,000 tests are being made available. So the consistency of their messaging around testing is very poor. Oh, I have to go. Thanks so much for listening, everybody. Where have all my comments gone from Periscope? That's all right. I guess there's no more Periscope travelers. Now, I'm giving you the worst case scenario that is extremely likely to happen given the factors that I enumerated. And if you don't pay attention to what I'm saying, more fool you, because if you paid attention to what I was saying a few weeks ago, you wouldn't have invested heavily in the stock exchange. If my husband listened to me a few weeks ago, he'd have more money than he has now. Yes, America has a proactive mentality, but there are just a lot of negative factors that need to be taken into consideration. And hopefully we see a resurgence of community spirit and also a rehabilitation of the image of government, that good governance, efficient governance is needed, as well as individual civil liberties. Individual civil liberties are undermined when you have a tyrannical government who has usurped power from the other branches of government, like from the legislative branch and the judicial branch. The executive branch has poisoned the judicial branch, which no longer, the Supreme Court is pandering to the Trump administration, and the Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor alerted people to that. The decisions were being made in the Supreme Court that helped Trump rather than helped the American people. Yes, all of you who have investments in the stock market will be losing money because the stock market is bleeding out at the revelation of how serious this virus is, how the combination of infectiousness and mortality are going to smash a lot of industries that a lot of countries are dependent on. Wherever you have communities that are dependent on the tourism industry, Florida, economy ruined. Industries dependent on oil and gas are also threatened now by the decisions taken by Saudi Arabia and Russia. Yes. So you can call me OK Doomer if you like, but I'm trying to just rationally alert you to the likely scenarios. You know, you can pay attention at your leisure to what's happening in Italy. Shall we have a look? Let's have a look at Italy. Just so you get a little bit of a glimpse into what your hospitals are going to be looking like. I can bring this up for you. Okay. Share screen. Our hospitals are on their knees. All right. Italian healthcare staff of the infectious diseases department of the Padova Hospital wear protective suits and face masks as they swab people. Okay. All right. This is where I press. Okay. So view of tents near the Padua Hospital that will be used for patients hit by coronavirus. So you can expect to see your hospital parking lots fill with tents. People wearing masks as a precaution in central London, even though masks don't really help. Okay. So I'll close that. I'll find another one for you. Italy is bringing doctors out of retirement. Rome is deserted as coronavirus drives tourists away. How do you think the American economy is going to hold up once Florida is on its knees, etc.? The thing is, a recession is driven by problems with demand. So many ads on this screen. The streets of Rome are deserted after Italy recorded 233 deaths from coronavirus. It's different to the flu because it overwhelms your emergency departments. So here we go. This is usually packed with tourists before and after. And can you see all of the people there? And it's usually much busier than that as well. This is other tourist areas, usually popular with tourists, left deserted after the government imposed a lockdown on the region. So this is social distancing, people staying home to protect their families and their communities. This is usually full areas that are full of people. This is what's going to be reality for America, empty streets. I'm still trying to find you more pictures. No, that's not it. Maybe I'll do it another way. I'm not having any luck. Who would you guys like me to... somebody asked me if I'm terrified for my parents. Yes, I am. Yes, I am terrified with my parents, for my parents. It's my father and his partner. My mother died a few years ago, but yes, I am terrified for them. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is take that off the screen. I have a picture that I can share with you. I found it. Okay. So there we go. That is some people in Italy face down on beds, on ventilators, because lying face down apparently is giving people better oxygen saturation results. So they're lying face down so that they can have their oxygen levels brought up. But people who get this virus obviously have problems with their oxygen levels and require hospital treatment for weeks, which is why those pictures I showed you earlier, as in a minute ago, is problematic. Yes, so best to keep a positive, proactive approach. Sure. So we're going to think ahead of advocating for our regional and local governments to take social distancing measures to shut down community events, schools, etc., sooner rather than later, to minimize spread of the disease, or rather to delay spread of the disease. It's important about delaying spread of the disease so that you don't have overwhelmed healthcare systems, so that you have this pattern of disease transmission rather than this pattern. We're in a campaign of mitigation rather than containment, which means we're still trying to contain the virus. We don't want people to spread it, but particularly we want the spread to take longer. So eventually everybody will get it, will build up immunity to it. It might have a resurgence next winter, we don't know. But right now, so many healthcare systems are likely to breach the healthcare capacity margins and to have overwhelm, as well as there being incredible economic dysfunction and stock exchange loss, because Trump appointed people who undermine organizations rather than promote the work that they're supposed to do. I don't even have to say Trump. I just have to say too many politicians are in power who actively are against efficient governance. They're only about active redistribution of tax dollars back to businesses and wealthy people, and the relaxing of regulations on wealthy business owners. So the vaccines have been found. They're in testing mode, and testing vaccines takes between a year and a year and a half to do all of the trials necessary. Yes, so the Spanish flu, which killed a lot of people, that was after the World War I. So people were weakened from, the war, but they were also weakened from governments wanting to try and be more positive about it than reality justified. So we're going to try and not be guilty of that here. We're not just being negative. We're trying to realistically inform people of the risks, of the exponential rate of disease transmission, but exponential particularly in the context of no protective measures being adopted. So we all have to be powerful advocates for protective measures being adopted, such as social distancing, such as the cancellation of events, as well as the economically protective measures of trying to help people survive and trying to help industries survive through 3 months of flatlining economic activity. All right. See you later, everybody. I've said goodbye a few times, but then I kept thinking of something else I wanted to share with you. I've shared a lot, and now I'm mostly just conversing with people who are Trump supporters. Like I've got a commenter on YouTube, so Periscope people can't see his comments. I guess I could put up your comments, Fast Eddie, so people can see who I'm talking to. But Eddie's probably a troll, because weird that he says he's losing money, but he was also saying Trump would defeat Biden. And now he's saying that Obamacare is the only hope. So you like Obamacare, it's your only hope, but you also think that Trump will win. If I were you and you had heavy investment in stock markets, I would be prepared to just hold for a few years. There are cases in Africa. There certainly are. All right. Where are all the libertarians going to hide from this, and who are they going to turn to? That's a good question. The libertarians are just going to get very quiet. That's what you do when you're wrong. You get very quiet. Okay, chaps, thanks for listening today. Please let me know if you have any feedback, any ideas for how to organize this broadcast, or what format you'd like it in, if you like it. If I don't know, I'm just trying to improve my audience or broaden my audience, and I welcome feedback and help. Thank you. Bye, Alan. Thanks for listening. Cheers, everybody. Nope, hasn't gone yet. End broadcast. Ta-da.